Hello, welcome to another edition of Curtis Jones Writing. Uh, if this is your first time here, I have been reading every chapter of every book I've written, and this is my fifth book. I read Dad's Old Truck 1, Dad's Old Truck 2, uh, Imagination, and Love Endures All Things, and then Love Endures All Things Across the Creek, which is book 2 of that series. By the time I finished Love Endures All Things, book 3, which is called The Deep South, let's see, I don't know how to get it where you could read it. Anyway, that will be my entire life story up to uh, the point of being about 71 or 2 years old, something like that. Anyway, today's chapter is chapter 5 out of Love Endures All Things Across the Creek. It's stories about when my wife and I had bought a piece of property that didn't have utilities on it, and we lived out there about 18 years. So I think after about 8 years, we finally had the electric put in, but we'd already had a well drilled and done many other things. But anyway, this is the tale of those middle years of my marriage with Stephanie. Chapter 5, Living Off the Grid. Sometimes we hear people talk about living off the grid. What they mean is to say living without being connected to any public utilities. Living without a utility bill does not exist today. I say that because there are utility expenses, whether you pay a company that supplies your utility needs or you supply your own utility needs. There's no such thing as no utility bill. The expenses are piecemeal and usually paid sometimes daily or weekly, and then the big expenses like the generator you have to replace every 3 to 6 months. This is what we began to do when we lived in the community of Nycut. I know that man lived off the grid for most of the Earth's history, and everyone was able to accomplish a comfortable lifestyle without what man has become dependent upon today. In my whole life, I have always been connected to the grid, that is to say, public utilities. When we were not connected to the natural gas line, we were connected to the butane tank. When we were not connected to the city water system, we were connected to a well. And those times when we were not connected to a well or just city water, we drew our own water from our own wells. Sometimes this was done with a bucket, other times it was done with a hand pump. However, when man became dependent upon the public utility grid, he usually does not have access to a private water well or any other personal needs to connect to the grid. They're not connected to the grid. Anyway, we became so dependent upon the public utility grid that we are usually or unable to maintain our homes without that connection. People were able to refrigerate their food without using electrical power. My grandfather, rest his soul, grew up in a world without electrical power connected to every house. Even when he had electric power at his home, he still used some of the old ways to preserve his food. When I was a child, I watched my grandfather build a root cellar and can and dry stocks of food to keep him through the winter until spring crops began to produce. Stephanie and I were not afraid to go off the grid and to live disconnected from public utilities. We expected to be off grid for a few weeks until the electric company could hook us up when we moved out to NICUT. The thought of living without receiving a monthly utility bill to some folks is a wonderful idea. When this idea is put into practice, we quickly learn that the least expensive way is to receive the power we have become accustomed to, is to be connected to the utility grid. When we began to build the house at NICUT, we had acquired an electric generator to operate our power tools and to supply power temporarily. The expense in the purchase of an electric generator is not small at that time, or was not small at that time. Portable electric generators required from 2 to 5 gallons of gas to operate each night. Think about it today, where it's almost $5 a gallon. Portable electric generators require an oil change every 10 hours of operation. An oil change in a generator took 1 quart of oil. The generator required 2 or 3 oil changes every week. The generator also required about 30 gallons of gasoline every week to run and supply electrical power for 5 hours each night. I would tell my friends at work that I did not have the electric power through the public utilities as they did. I told them I generated my own electric with a portable generator. They thought it was a wonderful idea and wished that they could do the same. I would then explain that I generally spent in the neighborhood of $300 a month, all things considered, to have 5 hours a day of electrical power. I told him that the 300 a month included gasoline, oil, and the price of the generator. I also explained the generator had to be replaced every 3 months. They soon learned that living off the grid was not as appealing as they once thought it might be. In retrospect, I know it takes a great deal of grit and determination, not to mention the expense to live off grid. My advice to you is if you are on the grid, stay on it. It's hard to be off grid and requires much more labor than living on grid, and the work required isn't even considered. As we built our house, I wired it for electrical power from the grid. I also wired the house for DC electric power to run the house off of a car battery as well. The DC electric wiring was run along the walls and could be removed once we were connected to the utilities. The house had plumbing, or was plumbed, just as many houses or any house would be plumbed for water and sewer. I connected I connected and the water supply for the house to a raised platform upon which I interconnected four 50-gallon barrels that held water. In essence, I had my own water tower. It stood behind the house about 50 foot. It was as tall as the ceiling in the house. The water pressure was very low. It was like a siphon hose to run water through. It was just water from the creek and had to be filled daily. It was not for drinking or for cooking. That required better water than what the creek had. This was connected to the house by a 2-inch water line that connected to the house main water supply. Even at this, we had greatly reduced the water pressure that than we had become accustomed to in town, which was 40 pounds. We probably had about 10 pounds water pressure. The barrels on the raised platform were resupplied every day by pumping water into another set of barrels with a portable pump and transporting that to the main supply barrels. This required a trip every day to the creek to refill the supply barrels. In the summer, the supply barrels on the platform would become extremely hot, and in the winter, we had to drain the supply barrels on the platform so that they would not freeze and burst. In the winter, hauled, we simply hauled barrels of water from the creek and carried buckets into the house for whatever personal use we might have. From the outside, our house looked just like any house you might see that was connected to the public utilities. We have established ourselves in this way because when we tried to connect to the public utilities, we learned that the government sponsored program we had counted on to run electric power to our house had expired. The program ended the month we bought our land, even before we began to build the house. We were unaware and very disappointed that we missed out on that. Because we had no phone lines near our house, we were forced to get an expensive cell phone. At that time, they were very high. They were not very many towers at that time as well, so they didn't work at our house. But if we went about 2 miles away, we could get a signal. Hauling water was a hard job, a big job. I usually did that later in the day. I started by hooking up to a little trailer that carried the water barrels. I then loaded the gas powered pump and drove to the slab that crossed the creek. I parked on the slab and lowered the supply hose into the creek. I placed the outlet in one of the barrels. The process was repeated in reverse to get the water in the barrels on the tower. We started with an outhouse, but as the additional rooms were added to the house, we finally came to the half bath that was in the main hall. It would take a couple of minutes for the gravity fed water supply to fill the commode. I had installed the septic tank before building any of the house. We were glad to receive the or to remove the outhouse, but we were glad for it when we needed it. That's the beginning of our realizing what it's like to live off grid. I hope you enjoyed this story. The next story I'll read from tomorrow's presentation will be uh, kindness of strangers. If you get in a hurry and you want to know the rest of the stories ahead of time, you could go to my webpage on the internet. It's curtis-jones-books.squarespace.com. They have a link that'll take you to Amazon. You can acquire the books there. It comes in ebook and paperback. This is the paperback. And I also have a Facebook page, Curtis Jones Author page on Facebook. It has connections. It'll take you to uh, Amazon so you can acquire the books too. And you can see all the books at each of these sites. I describe each book and a little bit about what it's about. Uh, please subscribe. That's part of the way I am able to do this. And like the videos, share the videos with your friend. You can hit the little bell and be notified every time I post a new one. God bless you and keep safe. Bye bye for now.